cordial welcome from my part to this ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture, War in Ukraine, Interests, Goals and Geopolitical Implications. And the speaker of today, I basically don't have to introduce, right? So all of you in this room, I'm sure you know him. Professor Gerhard Mangold, he's Professor of International Relations at the University of Innsbruck. Has also been, and I researched that, professorial lecturer here at the Diplomatic Academy since 1995. So at a time when I hadn't even completed my bachelor yet, Gerhard, you were already here.
This is not a compliment.
No, it is a compliment. No, we're actually very, very proud of our adjunct faculty. They're very, very important for us. And Gerhard is definitely one of them, has been around here for a very, very long time. And everything at the DA that happens on Russia, on Eastern Europe really revolves around Gerhard. As actually Jean-Emmanuel Pondy sits here, he's been around, I think, for about the same time. And he runs all our Africa courses, so you're very, very precious, very, very important for us. Those of you who don't know Gerhard as a student, you know him probably from the media, and I tried to do research about that, about how many interviews or something he has given, and when you go on his website, and I recommend that you do so because there are lots of interesting articles and everything that he's written. Then you see that in 2020 he stopped counting the interviews, so they're not listed individually anymore. He just told me that in 2022 he gave 890 interviews. So if you break that down per day, it's a lot of interviews. And Gerhard, I know that takes a toll from you, so that is requires a lot of energy and everything. But you're doing really a brilliant job in explaining to us what's happening there in the Ukraine, what's happening in Russia, and surroundings. And I think that's a very, very important element of our work as professors, and you really excel at that. I should make one more announcement, because our students, of course, they also know that Professor Mangold knows a lot, and they run a student magazine. It's called Polemics. I can really recommend you to read it. And since they are quite tech savvy, more so usually than we are, they introduced something new, and they introduced podcasts. And the first episode of the podcast is with Professor Mangold. It's entitled War Without End, 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So anyone interested in having a look at that, I can recommend that as well. And then without any further ado, I'm going to hand over the words to Gerhard. He's going to speak for about half an hour. We'll then have ample opportunity to ask questions. And while he goes to the podium, please join me on the floor.
Thank you, Markus, for these very kind words about me and about my age. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and all other genders. I'm supposed to speak to you now for about 30 minutes on the war of aggression, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And when Russia attacked Ukraine in February last year, actually, it escalated a war that had started already back in 2014. We must not forget about it. And this illegal war of aggression, unjustifiable, has been a major strategic blunder for the Russians and for Russia itself. The war means that Russia already has been and will even further be diplomatically isolated, at least with regards to the Western countries. It falls behind economically, financially, technologically, and it has been weakened militarily. And particularly, its military reputation actually was taken down by how the Russian army performed in this war. Well, speaking on a strategic level, we already can say that Russia has lost this war of aggression. When we think about the initial war aims and the initial war expectations on the Russian side, both military and civilian, Russia is far away from achieving those goals. It will not achieve the goal of ousting the elected president of Ukraine, of installing a Moscow-friendly puppet government. And of course, what has not happened, but actually was expected in the General Staff of the Russian Federation, namely that after the ouster of Zelensky, that the Ukrainian army would capitulate, has not happened. And Russia has overestimated its own military strength, and also military experts abroad were surprised about the weakness of Russia's military, and they have underestimated both the morale and the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces to resist, and they have also underestimated the cohesion of Western countries in their pledge to support Ukraine militarily and financially. I want to show you only this brief map to show you how the front line is running in Ukraine at the moment. The red parts of eastern and southern Ukraine are areas that the Russian army has occupied. Almost all of the region of Luhansk, about 56% of the region of Donetsk, about the same size of the region of Zaporizhia, and about 50% of the region of Kherson. These parts Russia is still holding militarily. I don't want to talk to you about the war itself. You have all followed it in the media. You're all interested in the topic. But I want to just pick out the major elements of the war so far. After Russia had to retreat its forces in the north and the northeast of Ukraine, Ukraine launched two very successful counteroffensives. First in the region of Kharkiv in September, and then in the region of Kherson in November of last year. And actually, the offensive in the region of Kharkiv was so successful because the Russian forces were overstretched along a very long front line. They had a lot of fatalities, a lot of soldiers wounded, and actually for the purpose that the Russian leadership had at the beginning of the war, they simply, from the very start, had not enough soldiers involved in the operation. So, having realized that the Russian forces are too small, Putin on September the 21st announced a partial mobilization. He was forced to do so for these military reasons that I have mentioned. However, he had waited a very long time to announce at least a partial mobilization because he realized that this would have an impact on the public mood in Russia. Before the announcement of the partial mobilization, in Moscow, in the city of Moscow, we had just 34 soldiers killed. In St. Petersburg, just 126. So the war was something distant, a special military operation, a spetsoperacja in the south. But now, with the mobilization, war came to many households, when fathers, husbands, and sons were taken out of their families, taken out of their companies, and sent to the front line, often not very well trained and often not very well armed. Indeed, we can see, at least to the extent we can trust opinion polls in the Russian Federation, this partial mobilization, and another one is expected for the coming months, had an impact on the public mood. Since then, we have seen that the number of Russians who call for peace negotiations has increased, and the number of Russians who demand to continue this war has decreased. Overall, for various reasons, a majority of Russians allegedly is still supporting this special military operation, this war. The third point I want to mention about how the war evolved is that at the end of September last year, we saw an attempted annexation of the 4 Ukrainian regions that I've mentioned before by Russia. despite the fact that none of these regions is fully controlled militarily by the Russian armed forces, not even the region of Luhansk. At that time, I was surprised that Putin actually started this process of annexation, because I asked myself, what actually will Russia be able to offer in peace negotiations after now they have seized these regions? Putin will never be able to say, okay, Kherson for a year was part of the Russian Federation, but now we hand it over again to Ukraine. It's simply impossible. And after the Ukrainians launched a successful attack on the Crimea bridge, Russia, that's the fourth point, launched this months-long, very brutal campaign against the civilian infrastructure on Ukraine, water supply, power supply, heating supply, in order to weaken public support for the war of defense, in order to force the Ukrainian government to the negotiation table, in order to increase the number of refugees to Europe, and in order to even further weaken the Ukrainian economy, including its arms industry. Well, you all know what reasons or motives Putin stated at the beginning of this war. In his famous speech in the early morning hours of February the 24th, he had two main elements of the official narrative. The first was blaming the victim. He said, Ukraine has become a threat to the security of Russia. The West has turned Ukraine in an anti-Russia. So Russia had to respond militarily to defend itself against an incoming threat, military threat from Ukraine, which, of course, was and is absurd. And the second part of the initial narrative was that the Ukrainian government has been committing a genocide against the ethnic Russians in the Donbass, in the two regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. Despite all the brutality of the war since 2014, it's ridiculous to speak about an attempted effort in committing genocide against ethnic Russians. In the fall of last year, the narrative has changed. Now the official narrative is, it's not that Russia has to fight against a dangerous Ukraine. Now the official narrative is, the West has launched an all-out war against Russia. The Western aim is to defeat Russia strategically. The aim is to bring the Russian state to collapse. They want to break it into pieces. And in the late fall, it was added that the West has been launching a war against Russia because it wants to destroy Russian civilization. This, of course, is a narrative which is trying to mobilize as many Russians as possible for the war effort. In the past months, the front line has not changed substantially. We have had Russian operations, particularly in Donetsk, around Vuhledar, Bakhmut, of course, Avdiivka, where the Russian forces have managed to occupy only 52 square kilometers from January the 1st of this year. When I give interviews, I often receive emails why I don't tell the people anything positive, why I don't make hopes for an end of this war. Well, I simply can't. There is no way that negotiations could start and could be successful, not even on a truce, let alone on a solution of the conflict. Both parties to this war still think that they will be able to win on the battlefield, at least to make major gains on the battlefield. This is why they don't want to negotiate at the moment. Of course, both sides claim that they are open to negotiations. The Russians say we are ready to negotiate with the Ukrainian government every moment. But, this is a big but, they say the Ukrainian government before has to accept the realities on the ground. namely that Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson belong to the Russian Federation, which is unacceptable, of course, for the Ukrainian government and also the Ukrainian population, which, according to opinion polls, very seriously resists any territorial concessions towards the Russians. The Ukrainians say, we are also ready to negotiate. But first, they say, we won't talk with Vladimir Putin. We will talk to the next leader, is a quote from President Zelensky. Well, when will Russia have a next leader? Putin will most certainly be re-elected as president next year and will be the president, if he survives, until 2030, only to be re-elected until 2036. So waiting for the next Russian leader will make the Ukrainian government most likely wait for a very long time. Plus, the Ukrainians argue we will negotiate with the Russians after all Russian armed forces have left Ukraine, including Crimea and the port city of Sevastopol. Well, this would be a catastrophic defeat for the Russian side. What to negotiate about after such a development? So no, there's no chance for negotiations at the moment and in the foreseeable future. But what are the war aims? The West always claims, that's the often used formula, we will support Ukraine whatever it takes and as long as it takes. But what is it? What is the war aim of the Western countries? What are the war ambitions of Ukraine and those of Russia? Well, the Ukrainian government has publicly stated all the time that it wants to reconquer all the territory Ukraine has lost to the Russians since 2014, meaning including Crimea and Sevastopol. This is a maximalist approach, of course, very understandable from the Ukrainian perspective, but it's a maximalist ambition. In this ambition, it's very much supported by the Nordic countries in Europe, the Baltic nations, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and of course also the Brits support such a most ambitious war agenda of the Ukrainian government. Others, I don't want to mention names, but according to my conversations and contacts, are skeptical if Ukraine should really be empowered militarily to seize Crimea and Sevastopol. These people, members of governments in Western Europe, fear that by escalating the war to such an extent, Russia will counter-escalate, either horizontally, by bringing more countries into the war, or more likely and more dangerously, escalate vertical by using tactical nuclear weapons in order to stop a Ukrainian offensive against Crimea. Let me be clear, the use of nuclear weapons is not likely. It's not likely, but it's possible. It's a remaining risk. And some governments in Western Europe ask, should we call the bluff? Because the supporters of Ukraine argue Russian rhetoric about nuclear escalation is only a bluff. We should not self-deter ourselves. They will never do it because of the political cost this would involve, losing loyal partners such as China and India. But those Western governments I have talked to, or at least members of Western governments, they argue this risk of a nuclear escalation is a possible catastrophic development, and we are not in a position morally to try to find out whether the Russians are bluffing or not. The reason why I think that Russia might escalate vertically is that if Russia would lose lose Crimea and Sevastopol, this would definitely lead to the ousting of Vladimir Putin. He would not survive politically, and he knows it. And that is why he wants and why he must win the war against Ukraine. Western states always argue it's up to the Ukrainians to decide what they are aiming for in this war. A noble position. However, it's untrue. By the number and quality of weapons Western states are delivering to Ukraine, they decide and define to what military ambition Ukrainian armed forces should be empowered. So the West does have a voice in defining the war aims of Ukraine. And I want to quote Secretary of State Antony Blinken in a recent Senate hearing when he said, sorry, I need to take off my glasses, I think there's going to be territory in Ukraine that the Ukrainians are determined to fight for on the ground. There may be territory that they decide that they will have to try to get it back in other ways. This was a significant statement because it indicates that at least Blinken is thinking about a limit to what Ukrainian armed forces should aim to reconquer currently Russian-occupied territory. No negotiations, not even about an armistice. So how can this war end? Well, there are three principal ways war can end. First, a third party intervenes in the conflict and enforces an armistice. The second way is that one of the warring parties actually gains victory on the battlefield and imposes the peace regulations on the defeated party. The third way is that both warring parties get so exhausted militarily that they stop believing that they can gain anything by continuing the war. And then they sit down and start to negotiate. However, once more, not telling anything positive, from all these three scenarios, we are very far away from all of them. Well, I've already said that Russia as a state has been considerably weakened. It's aiming for a multipolar, or as they say, a polycentric world, in which Russia is a pole. Well, if such a multipolar system would emerge sometimes, it's not very likely, then Russia would be a very weak pole. A pole very much dependent on China, which makes China one of the winners, geopolitical winners of this war. Russia will be structurally dependent on China, and China can and will define the conditions of cooperation. Russia will fall back technologically. The Russian economy shrank last year by officially 2.1%, according to the International Monetary Fund, by 3%. You might say this is not very much. Certainly it's not as much as Western experts had expected or hoped for. But if you take into account that the growth prospect for Russia at the beginning of last year was 3.5%, we have to say not only has this growth potential not been realized, but the economy actually has contracted. And what is more dangerous for the Russian side is that the state budget actually is in difficulties. The deficit of Russia's budget last year was 2% of GDP, manageable still. But according to the development of the Russian budget in the first 3 months of this year, everybody is expecting a budget deficit of 4 to 5% at the end of the year. For a while, Russia can deal with it. Russia has a so-called National Welfare Fund, in which we believe $162 billion are kept. But this won't last forever. And given the fact that the revenue has been shrinking significantly, particularly the revenue from energy exports, and the spending has increased substantially, particularly for the military, of course, the Russian state budget will remain negative for many years to come. What Russia has witnessed due to this war is also an enormous brain drain. According to conservative statistics, about 600,000 Russians have left Russia only last year. Already starting from the beginning of last year, highly qualified young specialists left Russia, and opposition politicians left Russia in order not to be incarcerated, as Alexei Navalny was in 2020 or 2021, or Karamurza only a couple of days ago, or Ilya Yashin, to mention one other liberal opposition politician. Russia will miss these qualified labor forces. And after the partial mobilization has been announced, or was announced on September the 21st last year, another about 300,000 young Russians left the country in order not to be sent to the front line in Ukraine. What Russia will also see is, and we have already seen it, a massive increasing wave of repression. Russia is not a totalitarian state, because in political science we have a definition what makes up a totalitarian state, but it's a very hard and tough dictatorship. Yes, that it is. And the Russian government, particularly the Siloviki, the security service personnel and the military personnel in the Russian leadership, is ready to put even stronger pressure on the Russian population to wipe out every opposition that might emerge to this war in Ukraine. Well, the greatest geopolitical winner of this war is definitely the United States. The United States, by this war, is facing a situation where a rival, a peer competitor, has been and even further will be substantially weakened, militarily, economically, technologically. The Russians are achieving weakening a rival, not the greatest rival to the United States, but a rival to the United States, without using any single US soldier. The longer the war lasts, the more weakened Russia will be. But just to be frank, of course, I don't believe in those conspiracy theorists who claim that the United States has actually provoked Russia to enter into this war. No, this was a Russian decision, and now they are facing the costs. As I've said, the second geopolitical winner is China. I said that Russia will become structurally dependent in this partnership with China. China is also a geopolitical winner because the United States will have to continue its role as a security guarantor in Europe, because once more we have realized that European countries are not able to defend themselves. So US financial and military resources will be stuck in Europe for quite a long time, and these resources will not be available for the real rivalry of the 21st century, the rivalry of the US with the People's Republic of China. However, the war in Ukraine is not only positive for China. One negative side of this war is, and that is what China has been fearing for a while, that the United States will force the EU countries to join the ranks of the United States, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States when it comes to confronting China. And many European countries are ready to step to the side of the US. Others are not. France, of course, particularly not. Macron has stated so much in an interview with Les Echos a couple of days ago. So China will have to fear that the US will demand from the Europeans as a give back for the security, the military security guarantee of the US for the Europeans, that the Europeans will join the US-led bloc confronting China. Another institution that has profited from this war is NATO. NATO has regained its cohesion. It has its old raison d'être back. It's deterring Russia and defending, if need be, against Russia. The NATO countries have already started to deploy substantial forces on the eastern flank of the alliance, which will, in a midterm perspective, be those substantial combat forces on a permanent basis that NATO promised not to deploy in the founding agreement with the Russian Federation back in 1997. However, with Russia launching this war, this document was not worth the paper it was written on. Putin he demanded from the West that NATO should not enlarge anymore. But now Finland is in NATO, and Sweden most likely will be in a couple of months. And the war forces all European NATO members to increase their defense spending. 2%, which has achieved so far only by 8 out of 31 countries in NATO. 2% spending will be the minimum after the NATO summit in Vilnius, which will take place in July of this year. What I want to stress is that Russia is definitely isolated by the political West, and this will continue to be so as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, or a Putinist will be in power after Putin is gone. But Russia is not isolated globally. Of course, we had 3 resolutions in the United Nations General Assembly, and about 140 countries voted against Russia's aggression, voted against the attempted annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions by Russia. However, a lot of countries abstained, and particularly countries in the global south, even if they have voted for the resolutions, have not taken a definite stand against Russia. I'm not speaking just about China or India, but it's a lot of African countries, Arab countries, Southeast Asian countries, Latin American countries. The global south thinks that the West is equally responsible for the outbreak of the war in February last year. And if you look at the number of countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia, it's just 36 out of 196 members of the United Nations. Not even a NATO country like Turkey has imposed sanctions on Russia. And a lot of countries have not done so. The majority of countries has not done so. And others who have done so are trying to circumvent the sanctions by more and more creative ways. Europe is the loser of this war. European integration, the deepening of the integration of the European Union, giving it a military capability, that is actually no longer on the table. What Macron said in his speech at the Sorbonne in 2017 about European sovereignty or a strategic autonomy of the European Union, this will not materialize. Security will be provided, and provided only by NATO and not by the European Union. A final word on what are the prospects for Putin's cling on power. As I've said before, I don't expect any mass mobilization from below, even if the numbers of fatalities will increase substantially over the next months and probably years. Putin doesn't care about them. And we still, as I've said, see that the majority of Russians support the war. Many of them have resignated and are apathetic, have been for many years already, and they simply shrug their shoulders and accept that this war is taking place. They're not actually supporting it, but they are not opposing it. Others are not convinced about the need for Russia to enter into this war, but they think, well, Putin is a wise statesman. He probably knows why it's good and important to have this war now. A minority of the Russians is supporting the war actively. And then we have the so-called kreativny class, as Russian colleagues call it, the creative class in Russia, well-off, well-educated, urban citizens who have been opposed to the Putin regime already before the war, and of course are all against this war on Ukraine. But we need to take into account that many of this creative class has left Russia. So even given the fact that the migration from Russia in the last year means a brain drain for the Russian economy, for the political leadership in Russia, it's net positive. Critics, opposition-minded people are leaving Russia. And with all the repression that we have seen in Russia, I don't see that we will have any manifestation of mass protest against this war in the foreseeable future. What is possible is that we will have a palace coup in the Kremlin if the war actually ends very negatively for the Russian side. As I've said, a loss of Crimea, Putin would not survive. But who would succeed Vladimir Putin? Most likely, men in his inner circle, siloviki, people from the security services. Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of the Security Council, might be a successor to Vladimir Putin. He is, like Putin, a historical revanchist, denying Ukrainian statehood, denying the existence of a Ukrainian nation. So it would be Putinism without Putin, but with Patrushev. The same would be true if the director of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, would become the successor of Vladimir Putin. The foreign policy would remain the same. Actually, I have to say, there's no Western-friendly politician in Russia left who only has a slight chance of seizing power. This expectation or hope actually is wrong placed. This will not happen. So maybe a palace coup if Putin loses the war. But most likely, the war will turn into a stalemate. Crimea will remain with Russia. Sevastopol will remain with Russia. And so Vladimir Putin will take part in the presidential elections on March 17 next year and will be re-elected for another 6-year term. And so, as I've said, if we want to isolate Russia as long as Putin is in power or a Putinist is in power, the isolation, the freeze in relations will take a very long time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sobering words in many ways, but made a lot of sense to me. And you have the opportunity now to ask questions. I anticipate, as usual, that there will be quite a few of them, and we're always going to bundle 3 of them at the same time.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting presentation. Could you talk about the Wagner Group and what they're up to? Could you talk about the head, what he's up to? And could you talk about their activities, not only inside of Ukraine and Russia, but also Africa? Thank you very much.
My question is, why did Putin, who definitely needs success in order to survive, why did he not start with a so-called fifth column in the Ukraine? As a country is very, it has a Russian ethnics, it has a Russian language, it has a Russian history. which dates back to very long and very successfully from the Second World War.
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. We are always talking about arms supply, the danger, the risk from China. What about North Korea? What about Iran? And what about country like Egypt that has simply very close relations with the Kremlin?
Thank you. That's the first three questions, Gerhard.
Well, the Wagner Group, Grupa Wagnera, that's the name in Russian, actually was founded back in 2013 by a former Spetsnaz officer of the Russian Armed Forces, Dmitry Utkin, who very much likes the music of Wagner, and that is why he has chosen the name for this private military company. According to the Russian Penal Code, private military companies are not allowed in Russia. And this is true until today. So legally speaking, the Wagner Group must not exist in Russia. And actually, the existence of the Wagner Group has been denied by the Russian government for many, many years. They said there's no such thing as a Wagner Group, despite the fact that they have been engaged in Syria, in Libya, in Mali, in the Central African Republic, in Sudan, and in some other places, doing the dirty job that Russia didn't want to do by official soldiers. When, for instance, more than 100 Wagner fighters were killed by the US in February 2018 in Syria, the Russian side said, we don't know of any Russians being there. Definitely they are not our men. We have not been involved. So there was a plausible deniability for the Russian government for a very long time. So it was very surprising that in September of last year, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the founder and the financier of the Wagner Group, has publicly stated that this group exists. And now actually we have a center of the Wagner Group in St. Petersburg, despite the legal prohibition of private military companies. Prigozhin has very strong political ambitions, not for the presidency. He fully understands that he has so many enemies among the security services that he will not make it to the top of the Russian political system. But he certainly wants to become the defense minister. He has been accusing the defense minister Shoigu, the Russian defense minister since 2012, or the chief of the general staff, General Gerasimov, openly, radically, very provocatively. He has always claimed that it is his fighters, the Wagner fighters, that have been the most successful units of the Russians in Ukraine. That, of course, has angered the people in the general staff and the defense minister. Shoigu and Gerasimov are Putin's people. So is Prigozhin. So Putin has done a hard job over the past 8 months to lower the temperature in the confrontation between Prigozhin and the military. A couple of days ago, Prigozhin has made a blog entry in which he said it would be best to declare the war ended and not continue fighting. Some have claimed this is a real challenge to Vladimir Putin. For the first time, someone very prominent is asking for an end to this war. But Western observers should have read all the text of this blog entry. Prigozhin namely said, of course there will be no negotiations about the territory we actually hold. This is what we want to keep. And with this condition, of course, the war will not end because Ukraine will not accept this loss of territory. I think that sometimes Prigozhin has stepped too far. And I think that the appointment of General Gerasimov as the head of the Russian forces in Ukraine in January of this year, replacing General Surovikin, has been a rebuff of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Why? Prigozhin is an enemy of Gerasimov, and Putin decided to make Gerasimov the chief commander of Russia's armed forces in Ukraine. So he's playing a very dangerous game. If he goes too far, Putin will let him know. So he will be told that you're a wealthy guy, you are very well connected, but wealth will be gone immediately if you go a step too far. So I don't think that Prigozhin is a threat to Putin or has the capability of becoming the leader of Russia, despite the fact that the existence of the Wagner Group means that Russia has lost the state monopoly on power. We have the military, and we have a private military force, controlled by no one except for by Prigozhin. Well, why has Putin not tried to create a fifth column, a pro-Russian column inside of Ukraine? Well, I have to say, by annexing Crimea and Sevastopol, Putin made it structurally very, very difficult for Russia-friendly sections of Ukrainian population to be decisive in national Ukrainian elections. 2 million pro-Russians among the electorate, or almost 2 million among the electorate, were now gone, were now Russians, and could no longer take part in Ukrainian elections. So a return of someone like Yanukovych or any other representative of ethnic Russians or Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine will have no chance to get elected as the president of Ukraine anymore. Indeed, we had quite a lot of pro-Russian political parties in Ukraine, represented in the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. However, in early 2021, two important things happened which actually catalyzed Putin's decision to launch the invasion. In early 2021, President Zelensky, who had been elected into office in 2019 by the promise to bring peace to the Donbass, stated publicly that Ukraine is no longer abiding by its obligations under the Minsk II agreement. He argued that Ukraine was forced to accept these concessions, an amnesty law, a law on a special status for the separatist regions, a decentralization of the country in a constitutional reform. He said, we have been forced to accept this because we were military weak at the time. We no longer actually abide by this document. And he also questioned the Normandy format, namely France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia, to try to implement the Minsk document. He wanted to include the United States and particularly also the United Kingdom in order to strengthen the negotiation position of Ukraine in this diplomatic process. And additionally, in early 2021, Zelensky decided to ban pro-Russian, Russian-friendly media, particularly television stations in Ukraine. And he went after one of Putin's loyalists in Ukraine, Viktor Medvedchuk, who was accused of high treason. So Putin realized that Ukraine will, by the month, get more and more close to the West and leaves, step by step, the Russian orbit. So he realized that even with a fifth column, you cannot change the trajectory of Ukraine's political development. So in his eyes, an invasion was necessary. Well, we do know about arms supplies by Iran and North Korea. China has been accused by Western countries, particularly by the US, of planning to send weapons to Russia. Well, so far this has not happened. And I think it's not very likely, because Chinese companies, private or state, need the North American and European market more than the Russian market. And they are afraid of secondary sanctions if they deliver Western sanctioned goods, particularly weaponry, to the Russian Federation. What has happened, however, is that China has increased chip supplies for Russia, chips that are used in Russian weaponry, because before the war, before the sanctions, Western chips were used in the Russian military. Now these are replaced by Chinese one. If Russia is going to lose the war, then I do not rule out that China will deliver weapons. China doesn't want to afford that Russia loses this war. If Russia is defeated, strategically defeated, and that is what Secretary of Defense Austin has publicly stated in April of last year, then China understands that the full brunt of the US military and economic force will be directed against the People's Republic of China. China needs Russia in its effort to reduce US dominance in the international system. They don't want to see Russia fail seriously. So in such a constellation, I can think about Chinese arms deliveries to Russia. Well, if there was this decision by the government of Egypt to send ballistic missiles to Russia, I don't know. It's in these documents leaked about 2.5 weeks ago. It might be true. It might not be true. I can't say. I don't have any special information about it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next batch of questions. And Emmanuel, since you wanted to ask a question before, you go first.
All right. Thank you. Just as a few days after the invasion of Ukraine, President Zelensky announced or requested the EU to fast-track Ukraine's membership to the European Union. And as a result, in June 2022, we saw the EU announcing the official candidacy of Ukraine to the accession of EU. And many have argued that that will take a very long time. And be that as it may, in September 2022, we saw another application of Ukraine from President Zelensky of Ukraine's membership to the NATO. So my question is, do you see, similar to Ukraine's EU bids, do you think it's going to be possible as soon as possible for Ukraine to join NATO? And if yes, is that what the Ukrainians actually want?
Thank you. I'm gonna bundle again because there will be quite a few, and then yeah.
Thank you very much for your very insightful talk. My question actually continues of a question I asked you last year during the course, at the beginning of February, when you actually stated a couple of days before, actually the 24th, that you really hoped that the invasion would not take place because of the already considerable amount of interviews you'd given in the months up to then. And then you said that you did not expect it actually a full-fledged invasion. You said, if they attack, I think it will be something quick for the South. Only to highlight how even the experts were taking it back. And my question is, since nobody saw it coming, in retrospect, do you think the West has been too lenient towards Russia? And do you think a harder approach vis-à-vis Russia would have deteriorated Putin from declaring this war? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then the lady in the, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. One comment or maybe a question, maybe we overestimating the goals of the Russian Republic. Maybe it has never been the goal to destroy the neighbor, but rather like, please allow the analogy, like a parasite. So weakening the host for quite a long time, because I'm a little bit astonished that the Russian Republic has not gained more territory and actually has not defeated more of the Ukrainian. If actually it's a quantity that has always been the power of the Russian, never the weapons. It has never been like that. So my question is, do you think it's more of a long strategic goal to destroy the country or to weaken the country? And a second question, what about Poland and other countries of the former Warsaw Pact? Which role they play in the whole conflict? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then we have one more in this first batch.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I would briefly like to go back to the issue with China. You said that China and the US are the geopolitical winners of this conflict. And my question would be, how serious is China in their endeavor in terms of peaceful resolution of the conflict? They presented their 12-point peace plan, which to me is a mockery, but anyway. Are they genuinely interested in a peaceful resolution, or do you think it's just a they take it as an act to save their face, kind of? Thank you.
And Gerhard, I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, the Ukrainian government has also demanded fast-track negotiations with the European Union to join the European Union. There won't be anything such as a fast-track negotiation about membership. Maybe it was an important signal in June last year for the Ukrainian people that there is this prospect of someday joining the European Union. But the Ukrainian government has, it seems to me, raised expectations that this will happen quite quickly, and it will not. Actually, it must not, according to my view. Whoever is interested in deepening European integration cannot actually really think about making Ukraine a full member. Getting it as close as possible, yes, but not a full member, at least for the next 10 to 20 years, in a time frame where the European Union has to do its homeworks. Not only is Ukraine not ready for accession, but the European Union is not ready for enlargement. And therefore, maybe it was right to give them this silver line on the horizon. We will be with the European Union someday, but it might not happen soon. When it comes to NATO, Zelensky has asked already back in the fall of last year that NATO countries would actually live up to their promise of April 2008 that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And he has repeated these calls very often over the past 8 months. He will also be present, most likely physically present, at the NATO summit in Vilnius in July of this year. And there are countries within NATO who really would like Ukraine to join NATO, the Nordic countries, Poland, Romania, the Baltic nations, of course. But there are other nations who don't want to. Germany is not wanting Ukraine to be part of NATO. France doesn't want to. And in particular, as long as the war is not over, Ukraine will not become a member of NATO because of Article 5 security guarantees that would force NATO to come to aid the Ukrainians against Russia's armed forces. And nobody in NATO is actually inclined to do so. So a NATO membership perspective might be possible after the war is over, when the war is over. If it will be security guarantees outside of the alliance or Article 5 guarantees inside of the alliance is a question that is still debated among the members of NATO, as far as I am informed. Well, indeed, I didn't expect a full onslaught by Russian forces against Ukraine from the north, the east, and the south. In an interview in January last year, it said the likelihood of a military escalation is 70%. So I expected a military escalation. But I have to admit, I thought that we will see a military escalation in the Donbass, along the front line that has been established in 2014. Why did I believe so? Well, for me it was clear, as for many other Russia watchers, that this will turn out as a strategic blunder. And actually, I expected Putin to be rational enough not to risk what has happened to Russia because of this war of aggression, namely the very strong weakening of the country in every respect, in every dimension. I was only sure that we will see a full war on February the 21st, when Russia announced to recognize the independence of the People's Republics of Lugansk and Donetsk, which already triggered first sanctions by the West. At that time, it was clear to me that Russia, which gains nothing by officially recognizing the independence of these entities, would go for more, that we will see an all-out war. But just 3 days before it actually started, I was wrong in this regard. I'm not often, but sometimes I'm wrong, and that is quite natural. I don't have a glass ball in which I can look. I don't know what Putin thinks. I cannot look into his brain. I don't know. I just can make educated guesses and think in scenarios. But that's actually it. If the West has been too lenient, well, this is something that some nations claim, particularly Eastern Europeans, and many of my colleagues, particularly in Germany, claim. They are now saying Putin has deceived all of us from the very start, since his first election to the presidency in March 2000. He has used soft words about cooperation with Europe, with the United States, but from the very start, he was a revanchist and just waited until Russia was, according to his view, strong enough to roll back what he saw as the Western institutional expansion in the 90s and the 2000s. I don't believe in it. Actually, I've met Putin with several other Russian experts a couple of months after he was inaugurated as president of Russia. He was, according to my impression, indeed interested in cooperating with the West. Not, of course, because he was fond of Western democracy, rule of law, Western values, not at all. But his major objective at that time, or from the very start, was to rebuild Russia as a great power. And at that time, he was convinced that Russia would not be able to become a great power again without Western assistance with technological and economic modernization of the country. So I think it's wrong to say in 2022 he has planned to have an aggressive foreign policy from the very start. I don't think so. Russia is only to blame for this war, and as I said, it's illegal and unjustifiable. But this war has a very complex context, a long history. A lot of mistakes were made over the past 30 years, and not only by Russia, but by Western countries as well, which doesn't justify Russia's invasion, not at all. But now looking at this war as if it has fallen from the sky and has not had a historical context, I think is wrong. And this is what I very much criticize with my German colleagues. If the West would have imposed the strong sanctions in 2014 that he has imposed since February of last year, if that would have prevented Putin from launching such an invasion, it's difficult to say. But actually, at the very time, a lot of Western countries were convinced that they will be able to find a diplomatic solution to this crisis. And so they not simply ignored the potential threat by Russia, but they still believed in their ability to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis. If that was wrong, well, from the hindsight, it's very easy to say it was wrong. I'm not so tough on Western politicians of 2014. Well, according to my information and the information of many of my colleagues, the aim of Russia was to seize the government district in Kiev, to oust Zelensky, to install a puppet government, and they expected the Ukrainian armed forces to capitulate. This is what they expected. So they expected that they will be able to regain Ukraine into the Russian orbit. They never planned, of course, to occupy all of Ukraine. They had about 175,000 men on the borders of Ukraine. This number, from the very start, was much too low for a full invasion of Ukraine with the aim of occupying it completely. But they, with a false assessment, with false decisions, really believed that they could change the trajectory of Ukraine's political development. Well, Poland is one of the most important supporters of Ukraine, militarily, economically, with regard to the refugees. Poland is fearing Russia. Poland is also interested in Ukraine becoming a buffer zone between Poland and the Russian Federation. Poland is definitely the most aggressive Western country when it comes to deciding how to deal with the Russian Federation. And this attitude will prevail. I don't see that this will change over the next 2 generations. I don't see it. Is China interested in a peaceful resolution? Well, I said, to a certain extent, the war is beneficial for China. To another extent, it's actually a bad development for China. And we need to be clear. What the Chinese have presented about 6 weeks ago was not a peace plan, but it was a list of positions the Chinese government is taken on this war, which the Chinese, by the way, don't call a war. They speak about the Ukrainian conflict. And in this position paper they published 6 weeks ago, they indeed say territorial integrity must be respected, which could be interpreted, of course, as supporting Ukraine. But at the very same time, in this position paper, China never calls Russia to withdraw its armed forces. In this position paper, China repeats that the West is responsible for the outbreak of this war. They have stuck to this position from the very start of the war in February last year. Well, if you think about a country that would be capable of mediating, of course we would first think of China. But I think that the Chinese leadership does not want to take the risk. If China declares to be a mediator trying to end the conflict, and if it fails, this would be harmful for the status and the prestige of China. They don't want to risk it.
Thank you. There's so many hands up. I'm going to do one more round, and I'm going to do more than 3. I'm going to do something like 5. I've neglected this side thus far. So let's start with Jean-Emmanuel, and then let's go over there.
Thank you very much for, I think, a very objective analysis, because I came here to listen to what you really had in mind, and I must say I was very impressed with your objectivity, the way you present things, which are very much close to the facts. I want to really to congratulate you for this brilliant presentation. Now, I have a question which may be a bit strange, which is that, is it possible to conceive that some people are not interested in all this? In other words, this serious war, of course. But when you are in Zanzibar, next to Tanzania, when you are in the Pacific Islands, when you are in places like that, is it conceivable that such people are not interested really in this? They look at it, but they don't feel definitely involved. Is that possible to imagine that? Or should we, as the US Senate and the US House of Representatives or Congress did to send, I would say, injunctions to some continents, saying that you have to do that or else? So I wanted to know, what is your position on that? Is it possible to imagine that some people have other preoccupations, perhaps, in times of difficulty for this war, which is real? But is it possible to imagine that in today's world? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm going to move over there. So Victor.
Thanks a lot, Professor. My name is Victor. I'm a student here, and I have two questions. So first, you talked about the horizontal escalation of war, and I'm just wondering, so mine is more of an international law question. Eventually, would Russia be justified if they escalate like the war horizontally on the basis that Ukraine has also been heavily assisted by Western countries? And my second question is, what is the implication of Finland's accession to NATO? Does it mean anything for Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. And Benedict has a hand up.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk, sir. I have two questions for you. One is obviously the continuation of the war on behalf of the Ukrainians heavily depends on the support of the United States. With several Republican candidates or politicians in general having voiced their criticism about the continued support for Ukraine in terms of weapons deliveries, what do you think about this development in the war of attrition, essentially, which it is between the West and Russia? Do you think that when the mood in the United States may change, that the Europeans will have the capacity to continue support Ukraine with the necessary amount? And the second question would be looking at Belarus. Lukashenko has now requested Russia to station or to defend its territory as if it was Russian territory. And of course we have the whole pretext of the Union state, which the Russian Federation and Belarus are working towards to becoming. What do you think will happen? Is this Union state nigh, or may this whole project fail if Putin also fails? Thank you.
Thank you. And then 2 rows down.
Thank you very much, Professor. My question is concerning long-term perspective and long-term outcomes. And of course, there are a bunch of different scenarios that could happen in the long term. And one of them, which I find very interesting, is what happens if the Russian Federation dissolves, or at least some republics try to break apart from the Russian Federation. And do you think that is likely in the first place? And is it even desirable from a Western perspective?
Thank you. And then, Emmanuel, you have to run over there, and then we have 2 more questions, and then we're done. You asked a question already, and there's a reception afterwards, and you can privately. Maria, and then gentleman in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. I'm a student, and I'm currently writing my thesis on Putinism. So my question is, after the Ukrainian victory, there will be a new elections in Russia. And experts are mentioning that the Russian elite is preparing a son of Patrushev. And as we all know, the Russian politics, or the structure of Russian politics, is a modified version of Soviet politics. In other words, it's a party politics or KGB-ruled state system. Do you think there is still little hope for Russian Federation to become a democratic state, or we can forget about this? Second question would be that it's historically proven that all empires end up with revolutions, interstate ones. Principles of Russian regions started to build their own private armies. Does it mean that they already understand that interstate revolution is inevitable? Thank you.
Thank you. And then the gentleman there, and that's the last one. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Maybe I'm going to put the cat amongst the pigeons on this, and this might sound a bit presumptuous. I originate from New Zealand, so I see these things, I would say, much from a New Zealand point of view, but also we're part of a little family of nations, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. We're all quite a close family of nations. We understand each other, and I have a lot of contact in the other countries, Australia and Canada. To us, and I say this might sound presumptuous, but I'm fairly convinced, we ask ourselves, why does there seem to be so much pro-Russian sentiment in Europe? When you consider the way that Russia's behaving, it's pretty undeniable that they're behaving atrociously. And when you consider even back in history the way they treated the Poles at the end of the Second World War. Also, when the Iron Curtain came down, it was noticed quite clearly that all those countries that had been on the Soviet side were about 3 decades of development behind. And together with this, there's also a surprising amount of anti-Americanism here. When you consider that it was the Americans that instigated this program to help Europe recover, and the Russians almost did the opposite, regardless to what some people would like to say. We are astounded to think that there are so many people here of that sentiment. Why? That's my question. Why?
Thank you. Gerhard, one more time and lots of questions. No, you have asked a question already, so I can only do one at a time because there's so many. Yeah. I'm gonna call Kriska, otherwise we're gonna have a reception afterwards, and then over a glass of wine you can hijack Gerhard and talk to him more about all of these things.
If I get a glass of wine for myself.
You will. Red or white will be your choice.
Well, thank you for this question. I fully understand that many countries on the globe do not care. Because Westerners, Europeans, often don't care about wars in other places. The West is always trying to make other countries take sides, take interest in a war. If it's a war in the Western Hemisphere or in Europe. But who cares about the wars in Africa? Nobody. And these wars have been very atrocious as well. And I think, according to my view, I can understand that many countries are not interested, or at least do not want to take sides. And I think it would be a very wrong policy to force countries to take sides. This would be somewhat an arrogant approach to the sovereignty of these countries. So no, the West is only part of the globe. The West is not the globe. That is something that we need to keep in mind. Well, if Russia is justified to horizontally escalate the conflict because Western countries are aiding Ukraine militarily, the answer, though I'm not an international lawyer, is no. Because Western countries are simply aiding Ukraine in its self-defense effort according to Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. So no, the West has not become a party to this war legally. However, I truly say and believe that this is close to a warlike situation between the West and Russia politically. But there's a very strong difference between the political and the legal dimension. Some say that Putin has made a strategic blunder because Finland and Sweden are now joining NATO. Finland has already joined NATO. According to all my contacts I have in Russia, in the Russian elite, before the war started, actually, people in the foreign ministry and in the presidential administration expected these two countries to become a member of NATO. Not now, not in the immediate future, but in a mid and long-term perspective. We all know how closely these non-aligned countries cooperated with NATO armed forces before, for a very long time. What the Russian invasion has changed is that the majority of the population in these two countries now was ready to join NATO, open to accede to NATO. But Russian civilians and military people alike have expected that in a midterm perspective, these two countries will join NATO. So this is why Russia, in its 2 draft treaties, which were published on December the 15th in 2021, demanded that NATO promises not to enlarge anymore, not only not to the east, but not to enlarge anymore. In the draft treaty with the United States, they only said NATO must no longer enlarge to the east. But in the draft treaty with NATO, it was different. No more enlargement at all. Well, again, according to my information, there is strong belief in the Russian leadership that if the spring offensive of Ukraine doesn't work out, and the war will remain more or less a stalemate, will be a war of attrition. The peak of Western support for Ukraine would have already been reached. And then, from then on, the West would step by step increase the pressure on Ukraine to enter into negotiations, even on territorial concessions. This is the expectation in Russia. That is why Putin speaks about a long war. He understands that he can actually, that he could actually accept a long war. He has the staying power. But he thinks that the West cannot. And if, according to the result of the presidential elections in the United States next year, we will have a Trump president or a Trumpist president, and Trump or someone like him actually no longer sees the Ukraine war as so relevant to United States security as the current administration does. And when Ron DeSantis was asked what the 5 major foreign policy challenges the United States currently are, he did not mention the war in Ukraine. If that happens, if US support is going down incrementally, no, the Europeans will not be able to substitute for US aid and assist Ukraine to continue fighting against the Russian armed forces. Well, Lukashenko and Putin don't like each other, despite the fact that they meet so often. Lukashenko for a very long time has been so unreliable. He has always been playing off Russia and the European Union. He got closer to Russia in order to get concessions from the European Union. He opened up to the European Union to get concessions from the Russians. So Putin knows this, understands this, and this is why he dislikes him. But Lukashenko is now structurally dependent on Russia. Without Russia, Lukashenko will not survive politically, the so-called president of Belarus. This is also why I think that Russia is not expecting Belarus to enter the war directly. First of all, the armed forces of Belarus are not very capable. They would not add a significant strength to the Russian war effort. But more importantly, secondly, if the Belarusian leadership really decided to enter into the war directly, there's a great likelihood that we will see deserters and mass protests, a revival of the mass protests of the fall of 2020, which Lukashenko most likely would not survive. So the Russians know this, they understand this. That is why they are not asking the Belarusians to do more than what they have done, namely to open their territory for Russian armed forces and for the invasion of Ukraine in February of last year. Of course, the Russians are thinking about forming this union state. They have been dreaming about it for 24 years already. They are pressing Lukashenko hard to accept a final integration of Belarus with Russia. However, if there is a joint country, a united country, there can be only one president, and this president will not be Lukashenko, but Putin or another Russian. That is something that Lukashenko perfectly understands. If Russia collapses, well, as said, the Russian narrative is that the West wants to destroy Russia as a country. He wants to see Russia dismembered. And actually, we do have some fringe political forces who hold conferences about the so-called decolonization of Russia, stating that Russia is the last colony and it needs to be split up in several independent countries. Even if Russia loses this war, I consider the dismemberment of Russia very unlikely. But what I'm certain about is that it's not desirable. Definitely not desirable from a security perspective, from the perspective of Western security. Well, if Putin would be ousted after the loss of Crimea, if Nikolai Patrushev takes over, he will certainly not contest elections whenever these elections would take place. And I do know the rumor that some are thinking of making his son, Dmitry, to be a presidential contender in such elections after a palace coup against Putin. But there are several other people we could think about. One person who Russia watchers for a very long time now have identified as a potential successor is Alexei Dumin, the governor of Tula, the province of Tula. Alexei Dumin is in his 40s, so he's considerably younger than the current Russian elite. He has been in the personal security organization of Vladimir Putin. He has served in the GRU, the military intelligence agency. He was very important for the occupation of Crimea in 2014, which made him afterwards a deputy defense minister. And most people who watch him say that he was sent to serve as the governor of this Russian central Russian province in order to gain experience in governing. So they think Alexei Dumin is at least as likely a candidate for the presidency as Dmitry Patrushev. And I think he's even more likely to be the candidate, but because he is from the Siloviki. The young Patrushev is only the son of a Silovik, and that makes a crucial difference. I don't think that we will see a revolution in Russia. As I've said, I don't see a dismemberment of Russia, even after a war loss. Why are so many Europeans so fond about Russia and have a pro-Russian sentiment? Well, we see pro-Russian sentiment on the fringes of the political spectrum in Europe, on the right wing and the left wing. For the left wing, it's definitely anti-Americanism, or what they call anti-imperialism. And there is, to a certain degree, Soviet nostalgia. Despite the fact that the Soviet Union was never a communist country, only by name, and despite the fact that Russia is a kleptocratic, oligarchic, state capitalist country and not a leftist country. So why people from the left actually sympathize with Russia, I have never been able to understand. Why right-wingers? Well, you know, after Putin's re-election in 2012, Putin launched what I call a social-cultural revolution. He started to define Russia as the last defender of Christianity in Europe. He argued, in Western Europe, in gay Europe, Christianity has been abandoned by the people. Russia is the last defender of Christianity in Europe. And Russia is, in extension, a defender of family values. And of course, this goes particularly well with right-wing conservative nationalists in Europe. This idea of defining Europe as a white Christian Europe. Besides, Putin leads Russia in a very authoritarian manner. Right-wingers want leaders to run countries in an authoritarian manner. Thirdly, Putin opposes the United States. That is what some of the right-wingers actually like to see. Some of them still have reservations about the United States for its role in World War II. And finally, Putin is trying to weaken the European Union, trying to weaken the European integration. Well, that is what right-wingers want to do themselves. And they think that Russia can perfectly help them in this endeavor. I think these are the most important answers to your question, why is there so much pro-Russian sentiment in Europe left?
Okay, thank you very, very, very much. You are... for a great talk, for answering all our questions, for being very, very knowledgeable and very, very concise. So it was a great pleasure to listen to you. And as announced, so we're going to continue now. We're going to have a little reception next door, and then we can informally continue our discussions. Thanks a lot.